Hello! Today we will talk to Gleb Vladimirovich Nosovsky about the emergence of the very first major state in human history. In the Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology, there is a hall dedicated to this topic, called The Rise of the First Empire. It provides detailed information about all stages of the formation and development of this state, from invention of agriculture to the building of the empire. The exhibition hall features a multimedia map displaying the areas where the most common crops originated, as well as maps of the territories of the First Empire. Visitors can also learn about the ancient method of bread making. And now I would like to ask Gleb Vladimirovich to talk about the reasons for the emergence of the First Empire in the northern part of the African continent. Good evening, Gleb Vladimirovich.
Good evening.
Gleb Vladimirovich, please tell us why the first major state of the ancient world was formed precisely in the northern part of Africa, in the Nile Valley. And how did it manage to become an empire?
Well, let's take a look. This is the Nile Valley. That's where our agricultural civilization originated. That's where people ended up and multiplied. They were forced to engage in agriculture because agriculture could not have emerged anywhere else. This is thoroughly explained in our books. And this is not just our point of view, but also the perspective of other researchers. Agriculture emerged due to exceptional reasons. The Nile Valley is an extraordinary place on Earth, which represents a narrow, fertile strip of land surrounded by deserts from all sides, where agriculture could be practiced. Not only in terms of planting and harvesting, but also in terms of developing different crop varieties. The entire area can be plowed, but extensive plowing is not even required. After the Nile floods, you just need to lightly dig the soil or directly plant in the soil. Extensive plowing is not necessary there. What is agriculture primarily engaged in? It primarily deals with weed control. In other words, we have to plow, we have to weed. We constantly fight against weeds that encroach upon our fields. Because our fields are surrounded by meadows, forests, and we cannot cultivate every last patch of land. We have a lot of uncultivated wild land. And that's where everything comes from and invades our fields, and we constantly deal with it. But in the Nile Valley, this was not necessary. When it was fully settled, all the land was cultivated. Weeds were uprooted once and for all, and they were all eliminated. The birthplace of hard wheat varieties is Ethiopia, not far from there. They started planting wheat and selected larger grains, engaging in wheat breeding. And the wild wheat couldn't interfere with them because there was a desert around. They planted it and developed the desired varieties. So, agriculture is based on the practice of planting what is brought from afar. In our fields, we plant wheat, but we don't have wild wheat. Therefore, everything is fine with us. But in places where there is wild wheat, before the advent of herbicides, wheat couldn't be grown. It would immediately crossbreed and become wild. That's why all the varieties in our agriculture are imported from afar. Nikolai Vavilov also pointed this out. Agriculture is based on growing something other than what could be brought from the neighboring forest. No, it's not like that. It's about what is brought from thousands of kilometers away and what is not available in the neighboring forest. Only then can agriculture be successfully practiced. And how do you imagine an ancient person, let's say from Russia, traveling thousands of kilometers for some cucumbers from China and then returning, bringing them and planting them? Not just cucumbers, but wheat, oats, all of that had to be brought from thousands of kilometers away. Can you imagine what a long journey it would be in those times when there was no statehood and each tribe lived in its own place? They would have been immediately robbed and killed. It was difficult to leave one's village. They couldn't stray from their small patch of land, which was governed by some community. Strangers would be immediately robbed and killed. And why not? There were no laws on this matter. That's why long-distance travel was excluded. It only became possible when a huge state emerged. We don't realize that these journeys for seeds and communication between distant parts of the land are only possible if there are protected communication routes. Without them, it was impossible. That's why this center of civilization emerged precisely in the Nile Valley, because everything was limited by the desert and all the land was cultivated. And that's where it all began. They didn't have to travel thousands of kilometers to get something that didn't grow around them. They could cultivate local plants, simply cultivate all these plants, and there were no wild ones left. That's why the initial agriculture emerged here. Then this center, which has access to the Mediterranean Sea, started spreading along the coasts. Because they didn't have any horses, they traveled on boats. And they sailed away from there on these boats. In this breeding ground, the world's first empire emerged. Armed forces were formed, and royal power emerged. Unlike all the other tribes, which sat in their own corners, a powerful center emerged here that had a strong agricultural base, its own armed forces, and began to spread, conquering or slaughtering, or assimilating all the other tribes. Initially, they simply slaughtered them. And they spread along the coasts of the Mediterranean Sea. Where did this ancient Mediterranean culture come from? Its roots go back to the time when this emerging empire had its capital in Egypt. They settled along the coast, wherever they could reach. And where could they reach along the coasts? They settled along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. They settled along the coast of the Black Sea. They entered major rivers that flow into the Black and Mediterranean Seas. They entered major rivers in the Black Sea region, the Don, the Danube, and the Volga. Because, you see, between the Don and the Volga is not far at all. There is a canal there now, but before, there was a portage. There is a small river there. Much less distance needs to be covered. There are rivers that flow into the Don and Volga. They are very close to each other. This is the ancient portage from the Don to the Volga. In other words, they reached the coast of the Caspian Sea, traveled up the Dnieper, the Danube, the Volga. It was from the Egyptian center that they settled all of this, sailing on boats. Look at what happened next. It turned out that they found themselves on the edge of the world they had colonized. They couldn't move south. There, the desert immediately begins, followed by tropical jungles. They didn't even know where the Nile originated. They tried to move south but couldn't. They couldn't advance here. They sailed along the Red Sea, sailed to India. That was also colonized. But in addition to all that, they settled all of this northern part. This was their colonized world. And they found themselves on the very edge of this world, because reaching India was still far. And here, in the Arabian Peninsula, there is a desert. They had connections with India and Siam, what is now called Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, that was ancient Siam. But those were remote parts. In immediate proximity to them was this region, the coasts of rivers and seas. And finding themselves on the periphery, they naturally and wisely moved their capital here, to the center of the world they had colonized, to the Bosporus, between the Black and Mediterranean seas. Moreover, Egypt doesn't have iron ore, and by that time, they had already discovered iron. But there is plenty of it in the Balkans. Egypt has many resources. Iron ore exists everywhere, just not in Egypt. There is gold and copper in Egypt, but there is no iron there, and there is no fuel to smelt it. Therefore, when iron appeared, they naturally moved here. This was the optimal point. But they already had knowledge of agriculture, their own seeds, and the ability to cultivate the land, and so on. And, as we believe, Christ invented the scythe, judging by his reflection as Emperor Andronikos Komnenos. In other words, the invention of the scythe enabled animal husbandry in northern lands. Without a scythe, you cannot feed the livestock in winter. You need to stockpile a huge amount of hay. In Egypt, they used sickles. It's impossible without a scythe. When the scythe was invented, the meadows were mowed, and the population in the north started to grow rapidly. The scythe made it possible. It's no wonder that Emperor Andronikos Komnenos, who is a reflection of Christ, as Byzantine historians write, ordered to depict himself as a farmer with a scythe in his hands. Here, Christ was an emperor. Here he was crucified, and then a completely different history began. The capital moved north. At first, everything fell apart, then it moved north. But that's a long conversation, not for this film. Visit the Museum of the New Chronology in Yaroslavl. It's a wonderful museum, where everything is explained in great detail and visually presented. The entire history, according to the New Chronology, how it developed with all the details, with a modern presentation of the material on interactive screens. The museum is very well made, and I recommend it to everyone. For those who have never read our books, I suggest visiting simply to acquaint themselves with our reconstruction, not the methods, that's a separate topic. We have a complete set of books that presents the methods of the New Chronology as well as all the proofs. And if someone wants to familiarize themselves with the final result first and then, if they find it interesting, delve into the proofs and justifications, I recommend that person read our multi-volume work, consisting of small volumes, called Russia and Rome. Not the previous Russia and Rome, that was published long ago, but the recent popular books under the same title, Russia and Rome. 3 books have been released. The first book, How It All Began, the second book, Christ, and the third book, After Christ. In the spring, the 4th book will be released, titled, The Great Conquest of the World. It's a story about how history is viewed according to the New Chronology. And if you want to delve deeper, if you want to know the details, we have many books that explain the New Chronology in great detail. All of this can be found on our website chronologia.org. Or you can visit the museum. It's also a wonderful opportunity to get acquainted with the new chronology without spending weeks or months reading books, just by visiting the museum. So, I invite you to familiarize yourself with how our history is actually structured. I believe that it is important for every educated person to understand this. Because without understanding our past, we cannot fully understand the present.
Gleb Vladimirovich, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
In our next video, Gleb Vladimirovich Nosovsky will talk about one of the most important discoveries of the new chronology. Join us in a week on the channel of the Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology.